our third and final talk in this session on manuscripts is by Richard Sharpe. Richard is Professor of Diplomatic at Oxford University, and he's taking us to Ireland, I think. Yes? So we've been to Peru, we've been to Switzerland, we're now in Ireland. He's going to talk about, intriguingly, about a hidden collection of Irish manuscripts.
Thank you. And I don't know how many of you will be aware of the existence of large numbers of late Irish manuscripts. Between about 1670 and 1820, 1830, an active vernacular manuscript culture flourished in Ireland following the collapse of the old classical Gaelic culture, when Irish was to a considerable degree unable to establish a good relationship with print. I got interested in manuscripts of this kind, thinking that as a medievalist, here was a test case for me to look at a manuscript culture with what I could consider modern evidence. I'm working on a book built around auctions and sales of Irish manuscripts between 1766 and 1902. But the key period is between about 1833 and between 1830 and 1850, when we see Irish manuscripts reaching the Dublin sale rooms in some numbers and being bought by middle-class people with money and little or no Irish, but who channeled them into permanent collections. So one's looking at the transfer of what are essentially vernacular books that belong to farmers, peasants, hedge schoolmasters, as they're called in Ireland, sometimes parish clerks, who use the Irish language in writing and in speech, and who don't have any money. Via collectors, they reach the Royal Irish Academy and other institutions and have therefore survived. The most important collection formed in this period is the Hodges and Smith collection. Hodges was a bookseller, Smith had money, and they went into partnership. And between 1833 and 39, Smith bought 227 Irish manuscripts, mainly in County Clare and County Limerick, where he had an agent, Eugene O'Curry, who was employed at the lunatic asylum in Limerick, but his father had been a hedge schoolmaster and scribe, and O'Curry had worked as a scribe in his youth. George Smith brought him to Dublin in 1839 and paid him to do a catalogue of the 227 manuscripts, which in 1843 were then offered to the Royal Irish Academy for 1,250 guineas. The Academy had just made 2 purchases of antiquities, and so, as it were, Hodges and Smith, or Smith, decided this was the moment to strike. The purchase was completed, took a bit of time, and a grant of £600 was given by the government in London to the Academy. That, I say, is the most important collection, but today I want to talk about the much less recognised collection formed by Sir William Beetham. He offered 150 manuscripts to the Royal Irish Academy in 1846, 2 years after the completion of the Hodges and Smith purchase. Now, whereas Smith had paid O'Curry to produce a 693-page catalogue when offering, Beetham didn't have that kind of contacts. His collection was, after a 5-year period of uncertainty, acquired, for the most part, by the Academy, and it's been there ever since. It's not indexed as a collection in the catalogue produced between 1926 to 43, with indexes 1948 to 58. So whereas users of manuscripts in the Academy would go to the Hodges and Smith catalogue or to the first series catalogue, there was nothing that they could go to as a Beetham catalogue. And when the modern catalogue was done, these historic collections were simply scattered willy-nilly. It didn't run by shelf mark, it didn't run by historic collections. It ran by the whim of the first editor and thereafter, I think, as people working on the catalogue did deals over what they got to do next. So the sequence is actually extremely frustrating. The cataloguers intended that there should be a general introduction, but it was never written. And so when in the 1980s, Brendan O'Connor in Cork did a very important catalogue of work by County Cork scribes, he thought there were 13 manuscripts in the Beetham collection by Cork scribes. It's not clear that he was aware of any other Beetham collection manuscripts. When we understand the collection, there are nearly 50 items written by one family of Cork scribes over 3 generations, and I think there's about 30, perhaps more, manuscripts that Beetham bought through 2 members of that family, in the youngest generation, the twins Paul and Padar O'Longain, sons of the much more famous scribe Michal Og O'Longain. Now, I won't linger over Beetham's backstory. He was an Englishman who found work as a herald in Dublin. Irish writers in the 1840s referred to him as finding work as a clerk with Ulster King of Arms, and he climbed his way up to become Ulster King of Arms. He became a member of the Royal Irish Academy and had a certain interest in manuscripts. He had an important collection of genealogical and heraldic material and of historical papers. He bought and sold medieval manuscripts, and he bought and sold a number of important medieval Irish manuscripts. You may have heard of the Book of Dimmer, which came from a doctor in Nina, passed through the hands of the librarian of the King's Inns into Beetham's hands, who then touted it around, including auction rooms, until he got a price he was happy with from Trinity College Dublin. The Book of Ivania is a later manuscript, very important for its Irish texts, late 14th, early 15th century. Beetham in contemporary information is never perceived as a collector. People interested in Irish books in the 1840s and 50s never look on Beetham as a player. He occasionally goes public with his views on the Irish language, but he never learnt to do more than use a contemporary Irish dictionary or ask a servant what this or that Irish word meant. However, in March 1846, he wrote to James Hardiman, another member of the Royal Irish Academy, proposing to sell his collection at the price he had paid to acquire the books, £1,500. He, I think, is simply trying to cash in on what's happened with the Hodges and Smith collection. The Academy is flat broke after having bought 2 collections of antiquities and the Hodges and Smith collection. And nothing happens until December, by which time he says, well, maybe £1,000 would do. And the Academy sends a committee round to his house to take a look at his Irish manuscripts and to value them. And what we've got on the screen is the first page of the valuation list compiled by this committee. It was a strong committee. Charles Graves and J.H. Todd were, as it were, influential figures in Trinity College and the ascendancy, as we might still call it. But John O'Donovan was the expert on Irish history and language at the time, and Eugene O'Curry, who went along as a sort of other ranks assistant, was the expert on Irish manuscripts of the period. And they come up with values. Now, I'm going to change, this is the first page, it tells you that who's going, what date they assemble, and the first manuscript, 1, 2, 3, I'm looking down, you've got Roman numerals and Arabic numerals with a ring round, and then other numbers, G20, G22, G24, is it? G23, G25. This goes on 8, 9, 10, 81 and 91 and 105. So the arrangement of the manuscripts in the house is not very clear, onto another shelf, and we pick up 11, 12, 13, and then carry on neatly 14, 15, 16, 17, down to and including 22. The Arabic number is the list number, and when the books were packed up and moved to the Academy in 1851, that number and A was written in the back. The Roman numerals are, so to speak, Beetham numbers that were assigned by the person he employed around 1845-6 to go over the collection and tidy it up for sale. And the numbers with a letter, G's and N's on this page, those are shelf marks. The Academy acquired these things in 1851. It moved house in 1852. The manuscripts, I have no idea where the manuscripts were shelved between the move into the new house in 52 and the installation of case 23 in 1866. And the G and N numbers are straightforward shelf marks in that case, added by J.T. Gilbert as librarian when the manuscripts were properly shelved. From the point of view of the Beetham collection, this is a treasure trove. It describes all of the manuscripts briefly. It gives us their Beetham number, their Academy number, their shelf mark, and a valuation. And the valuation added up to £1,021. 16 manuscripts were set aside as not worth having, all of them associated with someone called Owen Connellan, who had been Beetham's advisor. Yet this valuation list was not used by the Irish Academy's cataloguers. It's not even in the catalogue, and the cataloguers refer to Beetham numbers willy-nilly as to whether they're citing the Academy number in Arabic here, or the Beetham number in Roman. So getting from the published catalogue to a sense of the Beetham collection, even by reading through the whole thing, is not completely straightforward. From minutes of the Academy and from correspondence, I can track that the sale was not swiftly completed. The Academy eventually writes to him and says, there's no way we'll reach £1,000. What about coming up with the sum we can reach? £500 was agreed on. Benjamin Lee Guinness handed over the last cheque for £20, and the purchase was completed in April 1851. I didn't take pictures of it, but there's a long press report of the public meeting for the Academy to say we are receiving this collection from the committee that's organised the purchase. Runs to about 7,000 words, does the report of proceedings. On the basis of the valuation list, we can see 134 manuscripts bought, 16 rejected, and I will include the text of that list annotated on the basis of the actual manuscripts in my book on Irish manuscript sales. Now, going through the actual books, I found myself caught in a snare trying to track the Roman numerals and relate them to the bindings. The books are, for the most part, in Beetham bindings, and you can see that these are fairly samey. They have Beetham's elephant crest, they have a label, the binding is in marbled paper. I pulled out the one that's in the wrong colour for this run, and these are the larger end of 1 to 22, and that's the smaller end of 1 to 22, so you have 11 and then 12 to 22 in a uniform size. There are 4 batches of Beetham bindings, all slightly different, all representing consecutive runs of numbers, but they go 1 to 22, 24 to 29, 84 to 105, and then 106 to 110, with 30 to 83 not uniform, but there are 15 of those that are in a different uniform binding, which may represent an earlier phase of Beetham's collecting or may represent a source, and I haven't worked out the logic. There is, as far as I can tell, no rationale to the grouping by binding or to the numbering. This is Owen Connellan's work, and I'm guessing he's doing it in 1845 into 46. 1 to 22 are all labelled O'Longan manuscripts, and I can tell that two of them were still definitely in Micheál Óg O'Longain's hands in 1837. One of them is copied by Padar O'Longain in 1842, and the same one is copied by Paul O'Longain in 1844. So that it looks as though the sale of these 1 to 22 was not completed until 1844 at the earliest, only 2 years before Beetham's offer to the Academy. And yet, number 145 in the valuation list, near the very end, which has no Roman numeral, so Connellan didn't get that far in his working and has been rebound in the 1850s, is a book that I can demonstrate Beetham bought in 1840, when he bought an unspecified number of books from Paul O'Longain. Now, with 1 to 22, I've been able to cross-match with this, which I call the offer list. We have a numbered list, we have titles, we have a number of pages, and then they're all described as large folio regardless of their actual size. This list has 24 items on it, and at the end it says, written by the two best Irish scholars of the age, by the father and son, Michael Long Sr., that's Micheál MacPadda, died 1770, and Michael Long Jr., Micheál Óg, who died in 1837. This is in the Irish Academy. It's catalogued with no Beetham connection. It's among material associated with William Elliot Hudson that came in 1853, and the cataloguers had no idea what it was. But those titles cross-match with labels that we can see inside Beetham books 1 to 22. On the left, you've got Beetham's bookplate. On the right, these parchment labels. Beetham couldn't write Irish, and this is not Owen Connellan's work. I think what has happened is that the material is put together, perhaps wrapped in blue paper or what have you, with a parchment label written, I think, by Paul O'Longain, I think that's his handwriting, and shipped to Dublin, where Beetham will have it bound. But I think they're going up in 1844 or 5, and that's the point when they're put into a binding. These labels have titles that cross-match with the offer list. The number of pages, sometimes written on many of the labels, doesn't always correspond with the book as it is now. Sometimes you can see, there's 40 leaves that have gone from that one to that one in the binding process. Sometimes Paul O'Longain writing the label has taken one number off the last leaf, and the Irish catalogue, the Irish Academy catalogue, has taken another number. So before dismissing the mismatch of page numbers as not a hit, one has to look more closely at what's going on. Now, these 22 books turn out to be almost all composites. 2 of them are books. 2 of them are the binding together of broken books. And 18 are the binding together of Micheál Óg's papers. And I mean literally papers, scrap notes often, sometimes wrapped in a letter. So a rather odd thing for a discriminating collector to buy, and frankly useless to anyone who could read the language, unless you could ask Micheál Óg, by now 10 years dead, what he was doing. It's incomprehensible. So let's bring in another bit of evidence. I'm now moving off 1 to 22. I could talk about Micheál Óg's papers for the next 2 hours, but I mentioned that number 145, Academy number 145, with no Roman numeral, can be shown to have been acquired in 1840. Now, this is coming from correspondence of John Windle, who worked in the sheriff's office in Cork He had antiquarian interests. He never did anything of the remotest interest. His most important work is a tourist guide to Killarney. But he kept every piece of paper he ever handled, including letters he wrote as a 9-year-old to his mother to say thank you for my birthday party. All of this is in the Irish Academy. And in this letter we have Windle keeping a copy of a letter he'd written to Beetham, saying, "You may remember a man of the name of Long," that's Paul O'Longine, "who last year sold some Irish manuscripts in Dublin, I believe, principally to you." So it's only a rumour that Beetham has been buying. He's lately pretended to have lost a half-vellum, half-paper Irish manuscript lent to him by Denis O'Flynn. Now, I know little enough about Denis O'Flynn, but his father, Donald O'Flynn, was a serious Irish scribe and, I wouldn't say scholar, but a man with a real interest in the language and the literature. His story is a silly one. So he doesn't tell us what the silly story is, but he suggests that Beetham should look out for Paul O'Longine trying to sell manuscripts again. Now, that's end of December. Another letter a bit earlier is one of Windle's County Cork friends, William Hackett, saying, "I heard you deplore Mr. O'Flynn's loss of an Irish manuscript." Well, he knows that Paul Long, son of Michael Long of Carricknavar, who had a great collection, has sold 100 or 150 pounds worth of manuscripts in Dublin, ostensibly to an academy. People trying to persuade the owners, the vernacular owners of these collections to part with them at this date sometimes promise they're forming a national collection. They'll give it to the academy, they'll give them to Maynooth College and such like. My memory is so bad I don't remember the name of the person you mentioned as having lost the book on the Coal Quay. That's a market in County Cork. And I think had lost the book on the Coal Quay is the clue to what was referred to in the previous letter as a silly story. And here we have O'Longine, Paul O'Longine to O'Flynn. Remember, this is two Irish speakers exchanging letters in English. "I'm aware you are in possession of the fate of that book, whatever that means, but I'm under the impression that you are ignorant of its real history and how your father, Donald O'Flynn, came by it." Well, the story runs that from internal evidence, I can say this manuscript was in Carricknavar in 1739. It was used by a scribe there. We have transcripts, excerpts from it. It has the handwriting of Teigl Lummasna from Peafield, which is 20 kilometres away from Carricknavar, in it. And then this tells us that Teigl Lummasna, Timothy Lummasny, as it's anglicised, took the book to Cork and lent it to Dr. Murphy, the Bishop of Cork, who had a huge collection of books and indiscriminate. The bishop couldn't read it, so he showed it to Donald O'Flynn, who could. Donald O'Flynn took it away. 1830 he died. It's in the hands of his son. Paul O'Longine has somehow persuaded Denis O'Flynn to let him take the book away, and then claims to have lost it on the Coal Quay, when in fact he's sold it already in Dublin to Beetham, along with we know not how much else. And now Sean O'Lummasna, Teigl Lummasna's son, is wanting it back because he's heard three-figure sums of money mentioned. And so O'Flynn and O'Lummasna wanting it back, and then we have this business. "You had the assurance of searching my mother's dwelling high and low, up and down, box, cupboard, drawer, and every corner of the house for this filthy old rag of a manuscript." The manuscript in question is now 23N10. It doesn't have a fancy name. It was at that time apparently called Fuath no Marcha, the shape or apparition of the Fomorians, which Beetham translated as the hatred of the pirates. I can explain. The manuscript was written in 1575. It has 2 quires of vellum, the rest is paper, but it was copied from manuscripts of the 8th and 9th centuries. It preserves Old Irish texts in the best copies other than what we have in the glosses and such like. And 10 of its texts can be married up with a 15th century manuscript, Egerton 88, and they both acknowledge their source as the Cín Dromasnachta. The Cín Dromasnachta, the back, the ridge of Drumsnat, is a famous manuscript believed to have been written in the 8th or perhaps early 9th century. And it was Torneisen who worked out all this background. So 23N10, in a fairly poor state, had an unhappy history and was got out of the hands of Dennis O'Flynn by Paul O'Longoin and sold behind his back. Generally speaking, the O'Longoin family are viewed as scribes. Micheál Mac Padda, the old one, died 1770, was a scribe and a bit of a scholar, connected with Bishop O'Brien. Some of his books passed through an intermediary, Robert Walsh, Robert Branach, and then came into the hands of Micheál Óg, who was only 4 when his father died. Micheál Óg is a poet, and he does a lot of scribal work, but he's also aspirational. He wants to collect texts. He has plans for editing. In the 18-teens, he goes into bespoke manuscripts. He offers a list of about 400 titles he can supply. Order whatever combination you want. Bishop Murphy bought 110 such books, and he had sales around Munster, generally speaking to people who couldn't read the language. And he and his sons, who are activist copyists, are always judged as scribes. We have a list of books they wrote. We don't have any list of what they owned or what they bought and sold. The Irish perspective is to focus on scribes, but they had to have exemplars from which they copied, and they certainly kept those because in some cases I can list 10 copies made by them over a 12-15 year period. And they had to have a stock of texts to justify their claim to Irish scholarship. Now, it's largely guesswork from the scribes of the books and where they were, but going through the Beetham material, I reckon there's something like 45 manuscripts that have O'Longoin handwriting in, and another 30 to 35 whose scribes are either directly connected with the O'Longoin or who lived in the right area for me to make a supposition. And therefore I am guessing that whereas Hodges and Smith had O'Curry touting in County Clare and County Limerick, Beetham largely worked through his contacts with Paul and Padda O'Longoin in the 1840s. He is not interested in their usual bespoke manuscripts. Phillips would buy ancient Irish manuscripts on which the ink was not dry from Padda and Paul O'Longoin, but Beetham wasn't to be suckered that way. He wanted older stuff, and he got them to part with exemplar. So it looks as though we're in the end phase of their scribal business. And then after 1844, they bundle up their father's papers. So all those boxes and drawers and cupboards with my arithmetic, 8,500 pages of their father's papers are divided into 2 piles, then broken into books, into bindable chunks, and 22 go off to Beetham, and 25 in 1845-48 go off to Thomas Phillips. Beetham's correspondence had an unhappy experience with the sale room and libraries, but there's 2,500 of his in-letters now in the National Library. Absolutely nothing in there to give us a clue to his dealings with the O'Longoin. But I think he is simply trying to imitate Hodges and Smith by sell on at a profit. He has no interest in the material. He makes a bad deal in hiring Connellan to do the catalogue, which was never finished. The numbering is chaotic. The sequence has been lost. So there is a frustrating layer of Beetham information, Beetham O'Connellan information, through which I'm trying to peer to get at how that collection was formed. But so far, there's nothing in the literature that even recognises that the Academy has 134 manuscripts from Beetham. There we go, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Richard. Questions? Trying to take in the complexities of the story.
Summarised from an 89-page paper.
Right. Questions? Do you know what happened to the ones that Beetham had, but the Academy didn't take?
I've got the locations of most of them, but,
right.
not all.
But
yeah.
did they subsequently fetch a price?
No.
No.
Some of them just fetched up in the Academy because they weren't going anywhere else.
Right, okay. No questions? Yes, Nigel.
Well, that's not really understanding is what the real significance of this material for our knowledge of early Irish literature in the broadest sense.
Well, for early Irish literature, it isn't significant.
Early, I mean, medieval, I don't mean.
Yeah, something like the Hodges and Smith collection, that's real vernacular books, bears witness to the very lively literary culture that took place orally and through manuscripts in the late 17th and through the 18th century. Beetham is trying to get into that, and well over half of his books represent that material. So I don't want to undersell the content of the stuff. The O'Longoin are not great contributors. Paul and Padda are just factory copying, trying to sell, and they don't care who they sell to. Micheál Óg, I think, really did want to try and rationalise that 18th and 17th century tradition, but the work he did is so chaotic that in his own papers you can't make sense of it. Going through bespoke books that he produced, you'll find some of the same titles are reused over different contents, and one can go through the Murphy manuscripts and see how he's compiling, if you like, editing, but there is a general sort of disarmament treaty that if you're working on a text, you don't need to bother with O'Longoin copies because they're littered with errors and they won't do anything for you. So the O'Longoin operation is the end of a tradition. And it's happenstance that Beetham bought into stuff that they were handling rather than their own copies. But because the O'Longoins are looked on as scribes, this is completely ignored. Because the Beetham collection is not recognised to exist, his role is ignored. But if it weren't for people like George Smith and Beetham buying up the stuff in the 1830s and early 1840s, we would not have it now. The survival of that manuscript culture was already, it's on life support. There are pockets where you can say there's something of interest going on. And then the famine in 1846, 47, 48 just killed it. I've published recently on someone telling the son to chuck the grandfather's manuscripts in the river. We want to clear the room so that we can rent it out. So the collectors, however ignorant, saved the evidence for that tradition.
Which other countries can you tell have similar late manuscript culture? Just top of your
Well, I've done a comparison with Scotland for Scottish Gaelic, where there is nothing like this. Scottish Gaelic gets into print earlier, and what Scottish Gaelic scholars talk about as manuscripts are actually where collectors have listened to stuff and written it down, or are poets' own manuscripts or preachers' manuscripts. Iceland has the far and away the biggest late manuscript tradition that goes on until even the early 20th century. The number of manuscripts post-1670 in Irish is of the order of 3,000. The number in Icelandic is more like 30,000. And if you think 50,000 Icelandic speakers in 1800, 5 million Irish speakers, the gearing is quite dramatic. I was trying to find out whether there's this sort of stuff in Finland and Estonia a month or so ago, but I didn't really get any useful feedback. Wales, nothing like it. You know, Wales, the 17th century sees it go.
Yes.
Manuscripts, but there's a tradition in Ireland of printed country posters with lots of wood type and great colours and things that went on much later than anybody did in this country. Somebody did quite a study of it in the 1960s. So I don't know whether it's a sort of Irish artistic aesthetic or you know, that runs through.
Well, the business with print, you know, one can argue whether Irish was excluded because English was so dominant and all that. There is a small degree of printing in Irish in the 18th century, and some of it in Ireland, some of it is done by local printers. I've worked on something produced in Clonmel in 1802 in Roman type, and that went through 27 editions in Clonmel, Cork, Limerick between 1802 and 1841. The first Irish type edition is 1868. And I think the question of getting into Irish type was a tension. And it's actually Protestant societies that do most distribution of stuff in Irish type in the early 19th century. They have access to the funds, and they think by using Irish type it will be more accepted. But I still think that the priests went round and collected up these New Testaments in Irish type from the people who'd been given them and put them on the bonfire. The use of posters and what have you, I don't have a connection. I do like to record. You know, John O'Daly was taking subscriptions for producing things in Irish in the 1840s and 50s, and when he has a new book out, he would get a wood block, a poster printed with those great wooden wanted sort of letters, and John Windle kept them. So those are folded into John Windle's guard books. So.
Nigel.
Again.
I think the question is a good one because there are other cultures that have the way you have the phenomenon of manuscript copying in what I would call the medieval length of time, although material.
Yes.
I suspect that Sanskrit is the case, but I know that Russian is the case, where in the 17th and 18th century we have transcriptions of texts that are thought to have been written in the
Yes.
15th century, but where we don't have early manuscripts. And so that, you know,
Yes.
worldwide
I can't control the word worldwide. I can read Irish. I can't read Russian. I've done the comparisons for Welsh, Gaelic, Irish, Breton, and Icelandic. It's not so much just being interested in the phenomenon of late manuscript copying, but how it interacts with print. The texts that were printed by the Irish Franciscans in Louvain in Irish, using a manuscript imitation type, are all of them recopied in the 18th century in Ireland, and you find more manuscript copies made from print than you find surviving copies of the printed book. I've lectured recently on an Irish poem of the 9th century in a manuscript of the late 11th or early 12th, which was printed in 1647. The two early manuscripts disappear from view, but from the 1647 edition, I've got 30 18th century manuscript copies. 1784, we find someone attempts a modern Irish paraphrase, And the manuscript with the date 1784 is actually dated 1818, so it's a copy, has them en face, as you would with a printed book. 1791, they were printed, a 32-page booklet, 2 ninth-century poems with a facing paraphrase in modern Irish. That edition survives in a single copy in a library that has been selling things off somewhat privily, and I'm quite anxious about it. And there are manuscript copies from that 1791 printing, one of which was picked up on the riverbank as detritus from the episode I mentioned earlier. It was only because I knew about the poem that I recognised what I was dealing with in this wet book. But I would love to get people from different languages together to talk about this manuscript print interface. But it's very difficult finding the right people, and this is a displacement from a displacement for me, so it's quite difficult to find the time.
Okay.